Welcome to CBAW Loves, a book club podcast from Community Building Artworks. I'm Seema Reza.
And I'm Amelia Bain. Each episode, Seema and I will invite a rotating cast of fellow writers and artists to discuss a book that we love.
We hope you'll read along and join the conversation. Welcome, Amber and Elaina, editors of Someplace Generous, and our beautiful esteemed guest, Seema Yasmin, and Amelia Bain, our co-host here, and I'm Seema Reza. I'm really excited about this book. I actually had a dinner party when it first came out and just gave it out to people at the end of the party. It was like, I had ordered like 6 copies, just like, call me. And it's so extraordinary. I wanted to start with a question that may be impossible, and yet I demand that you give it a go. What is romance? Like, what would you say how do you define the genre, each of you?
So not impossible to answer for me, and it's part of what I am really enjoying about exploring genre fiction. Not just exploring, but diving all in on genre fiction, is that there are rules. There are definitions and rules. And I'm so into knowing the rules so as to not always break them, but like play within them, understand them, stretch them, maybe break them. So in romance, the broadly understood rules are the story centers a romantic relationship. So whether that be, the most conventional, quote unquote, romantic relationship you can think of, or a throuple between paranormal, creatures with tentacles, or whatever the constellation is. But the story centers a romantic relationship, and the arc of that romantic relationship ends happily. So that's the definition that I'm working with.
I did not know that. I like that though. Rules are kinky. So it's good to know that you had constraints.
Exactly. Rules are kinky. Yes.
That's hot. I don't read a lot of romance. It was nice to have an excuse to jump into this. I have friends who love romance, and I would like to write maybe romantasy. I've written one short story that I guess is like a romance between a woman stuck in a heteronormative marriage that's really sad, and then she has a romance with a djinn. But I don't know I don't know the rules. So now I'm like, I don't know if that story centers, but thanks for sharing that.
This is and this is what is exciting, that Amber and I have put ourselves in the place to publish, which is to curate romance and sometimes invite writers to write it, that we're in the position to just go ahead and say, yes, this is romance. But there's also what I learned in researching this genre is that readers who identify themselves as romance readers, people for whom it's like a really important space, are passionate about what qualifies something as a romance and what doesn't. And so there's like fierce, and there's not one answer, of course, just like everything, but there's like fierce conversation on Reddit or on TikTok or on wherever you want to, I'm sure, in book groups about certain stories. If are they fantasy that has some romance but doesn't quite qualify because there's not enough of it there for them? Or like the conversations that are most interesting to me are, does it end happily enough? And there's this vernacular of HEA versus HFN, happily ever after versus happy for now. So, one of the people in the anthology is the poet Richard Siken. And when someone asked him at an event Q&A what it was like to write romance as a poet, he was like, well, really what it takes to get to a happy ending is to figure out where the story needs to end. He's like, I went way back in history to find a happy ending, basically, is what he said.
Or had to sever the story, like in the story before life or whatever happened to the characters that would lead them out of the happily ever after mentality. Like where do you stop it so that you can believe that the result is a happily ever after and not just like, well, that's now and then comes the mess, right? Which is, to me, that's the part about romance that's so exciting is, yes, there's these constraints and these restrictions, and it forces I'm watching it force me and force these authors into what it means to dream into happily ever after, because happily ever after is not simple. It's not the fairy tale happily ever after. We're not, I wouldn't say there's a great hunger for those kind of stories anymore. Instead, we want to believe that within this fucked up world, there could be a happily ever after. And that means it's complicated. It's not simply ever after. It's just happily ever after. And what does that mean? And so playing with the dream of the future that continues on after the story, that's where I'm finding the most juice, I think, for myself.
Isn't everything happily for now, though? Like, given the impermanence of things.
It
Yeah.
is, it's like I grapple with what like the ethics and like intellectual rigor or not of consciously moving towards and offering out the fantasy of
Mm.
ever after, like the fantasy of ultimate resolution, the fantasy of, and it's been this really rich space to be like, you know what? Like I had this conversation with a young woman who's obsessed with the Twilight trilogy books and movies. And she's like, I met her at a meditation retreat. So, I was meeting her first as this like spiritual person. And then afterwards we started chatting and I told her about this project and she confessed about Twilight. And I said, well, what is it for you? And she was like, oh, I think it's about my attachment wounds. Like I read these stories because, I want to get to the place where the character isn't abandoned. And there's something healing for her about that and consciously choosing that. And that's what I understand about readership of romance is it's, people reaching for like some kind of soothing, some kind of space where they can hang out in the part that does feel like being held and trusting that that doesn't have to stop.
I'm thinking about Seema's poem that was in Poem a Day this week that is about romance. It is about life, but it's so much about romance and being in the moment of romance. And then in the bit at the end that like about this poem, you say, Seema, like everything ends, everything does end, including romance. Maybe that's what's got me also thinking about what is the happily ever after.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself when I was, thank you for saying that. I was finding myself as I was reading this, and I haven't read romance in a long time, like probably since I was, a couple of decades ago. And at that time, romance was really like an experienced, wealthy, or powerful somehow man and a virginal, inexperienced, ripe for the picking, like homebody. This was the setup, which of course is crazy making if you're anywhere outside of that. And returning to romance in this anthology, I found myself repeatedly having to like quiet my cynicism, to quiet my this does all end. And that exercise in this moment of life, of the world, of the history of the world, that felt really like meditative and healing to be like, shh, 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 just enjoy this. Just enjoy this. Like, yes, it ends with their wedding card. That's kind of cheesy, but also like, ah, you know?
I find myself in these conversations about love. I mean, my book is a love, my last book of poetry is a love story. And so I've been sitting in these conversations about love while this project has become and come together and then be in birth something. And so I'm just so fascinated because on the one side, the cynical, pessimistic part of me is like, here's my friend who's like, well, everything has a shelf life, whether it's death or 5 years or 2 years or 6 months. It's everything has its shelf life. So yes, everything does end, and life is lifing and will get in the way and make things messy. But then I also think about like I don't even know if I've told you this yet, Elaina, but we talked recently and you said something that like was transformational and threw me in a whole cycle of grief again about past relationships, which is we were talking about, I can't even remember what I asked you, but you said that you were talking to a friend and they were saying choosing the relationship over and over again, that essentially a relationship lasts when two people decide to say, oh, you've changed. I'm going to choose to fall in love with this you and stay in this relationship again and again. And I think there's like the fantasy hold on of like happily ever after and us knowing that it has to be a fantasy because there's no such thing like not but not always happily, even if it's happily ever after, it's not always happy in that ever after, like we know that can't be real life, it's fictional, but there's also this like promise, I think, that we want to make to ourselves. And it's something that we start to seek in our other stories too, where we can see the promise that two people could possibly choose each other over and over again in their various iterations. And for 5 years or 6 months or until death or whatever that ends up looking like. And I think that's also the promise in your poem, Seema. And I love that you brought that up, Seema, because like that poem got me in the heart. And I was just like, how wonderful that if you look back, Seema, you'll see a life of longing for this kind of love. And if you look forward, you don't see like, wee, rainbows and sparkles and unicorns. I mean, they're there, but they're also, mired in shit, mired in life. And the things that are also happening that are real. That longing, I think, is the potent part, is why people come to romance. Not just the salve of it, but this like, is there hope? Is there something I can believe in? And what I love about the transformation of romance, the romance world now, is that we are seeing these stories where it's real enough that we could go, oh, maybe there is hope. This doesn't mean that they're just like skipping through the flower field forever and ever, but instead that they like are going to face each other again and again and choose each other. And that's a different kind of romance than what we grew up on.
I love that. And that story that you're referencing, Seema, with the wedding card at the end, it made me cry because maybe I needed that reminder of like, it can happen. This is possible. It also made me lower the age range on my Hinge app because I was like, hey, she met someone. Maybe I shouldn't write off like slightly younger than I currently have. So, yeah.
I'm gasping with delight at that. I thank you so much for sharing that, Seema. This author, so the story that's being referenced is Isla Vejtani's Luna and Nora. And Isla just got a message from another reader saying that that it was helping to heal their relationship with, like, they had written off women who haven't dated women before, and the protagonist in that story is exploring queer relationships for the first time after a divorce, in a straight relationship. And I'm like, oh my God, people's actual dating lives are being impacted by the book.
I mean, that did make me reflect, Seema, on the conversation you and I were having via Instagram DMs yesterday, which is a continuation of an earlier conversation about biphobia and bi erasure and just the stuff that we know exists, but it's been really in my face in my dating life recently. And reading that made me think, yeah, I have my issues too about who I will and won't date and what experiences and what novelty I'm open and not open to. So I really needed that reminder of my own shit.
I think that's like the thing that keeps it with these stories is each of these protagonists is facing themselves in a way that I did not know. That's why I asked the question at the beginning of like, what is romance? Because that wasn't what I was, familiar with decades ago, was that they're grappling with their bodies and with their own shortcomings and with their own ways and having this real like path then to meeting somebody who meets them.
Can you remember what you were reading in terms of romance when you say like you were reading it a long time ago, if you can remember?
I mean, I definitely did read the Twilight series and found that to be the case. I'm more a VC Andrews than a Nora Roberts girl myself. So That was it. I wouldn't exactly call that romance, but that was some of my early stuff. I'm trying to think what else. I'm like, I can see a cover, the sort of stuff that had Fabio on the cover, you know.
Mm.
My mom had rules about everything from shorts to, but not books. You could read anything you wanted. And so I like this was I think the VC Andrews was really where I learned about sex. I don't recommend it to anybody. Seema, are you familiar with VC Andrews?
Barely, but I know a little.
Stand by your
Yeah.
mailbox. It's coming.
I don't think Flowers in the Attic passes the ends happily test, or is happy at any point test. But it is you should definitely mail Seema a copy. Seema.
For sure. Next book club.
We've been trying to sneak a VC Andrews into the book club since its inception. So
Do it.
yeah.
Please do it.
I mean, there's a growing, like, people are like remembering reading Flowers in the Attic. Like it might be like they're like, oh my God, remember when they had us reading this? Like they let us read this. So yeah, that was not one of mine. My grandmother read Harlequin romances, and like when she died, we literally cleared 20 plus contractor bags of years and years and years of Harlequin romances. My aunt was like, I'm embarrassed to drop any more of these bags off at the library. So they're going to the dump now because I've dropped 6 of them. And so for the rest of them are going to the dump. But yeah, like, and it's so interesting the positionality of it too, because like Elaine and I have the conversation often. I'm much more on the smut erotica side of romance. In terms of like what I'm drawn to, but also, I mean, I'll read anything, 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 anything. But like I've read it. I've read a lot. I've read Twilight series, and I was like, also the Twilight series did not come out when you were a baby, Seema.
No,
So
no, no.
don't say like
How
that
long
was
was it?
like
Like
your.
20 years ago, though, wasn't it?
It was a while ago. I'm just saying. I'm just
Right,
saying.
right, right. Well, like 20
But
years
then like
though.
50 Shades of Grey, like that's the kind of path that I'll go down. Is like what else is in this world kind of thing, or
Wait, you would
inspired
consider
by.
Twilight smut erotica?
No, but 50 Shades of Grey, definitely. Do
Okay.
you see what I mean? So like mine's an easy
Mhm.
leap to the kink or erotic kind of side. But I think there's something about the shaming or the girlification of romance when we were
Mm.
younger that I think is also really interesting to challenge and address. Um, I think my sister and I had this conversation recently. My sister's 5.5 years older than me, and she talks about like our grandmother, Mama, handing her a Harlequin romance and like her just reading it openly. And I was in secret, like putting it inside another book kind of thing. Like I was real sure that I was doing something bad. And yeah, my sister Margot's like, yeah, I remember meeting, like getting to the sex scenes and like meeting Mama's eye across the room and being like, oh my God, she read this. Now she knows I'm reading. It's like, oh my God, I could never. So it's weird to like this is one of those genres that makes you confront something in yourself about pleasure, about shame, about your body, and to do it openly in the stories is really, really exciting. It's really exciting. And the theme, I'm getting so excited. The theme for Someplace Generous, this anthology, was consent generally. And what does that mean to have each story in some way exhibit or question or push this idea of consent. And so then you get this range of a day in bed spent resting, with no sex on the horizon, even maybe, and all the way to, a very, very short, very exciting, thwacking scene.
You're making me think about how romance was really belittled when I was growing up, both as a phenomenon and as literature. So, like growing up in England in the 90s, in a community in which arranged marriages were the norm. I remember I heard of Mills and Boons because a housewife who read it was made fun of for reading it. And the joke was that her cooking was bad because she was too busy reading romance, right? So she had a displeased husband because of romance novels. And at the same time, my grandmother, who uttered very few words, one day while watching a Bollywood film in which a woman chooses love, a love marriage, made the comment that this was a very foolish woman and that you shouldn't choose a partner. That's not sensible to choose a partner based on romantic feelings. It's an arrangement that's really well considered and sensible and about the union of two families and a legacy. So it took me decades to get over that and to embrace and be vocal about the fact that I love romance in the corniest, punniest terms possible. Because so much of the socialization was like, it's foolish, it's for silly, silly women.
And pleasure is foolish, right? It's this sort of extension of that idea, like that pleasure doesn't have a place in your priority list of service, of usefulness.
And that this fictional space in which women mainly are and dreaming into a lover who will, at least excite them enough to make them want to have sex, as opposed to, whoever they're actually dealing with in the bed and in the home, that they're silly for thinking that they would have any like that's not how it goes. Like this idea that that's not how pleasure works. That's not how sex works. Like you're foolish for thinking that you're gonna have some Fabio moment. My job isn't to turn you on. My job is to impregnate you. Like I'm going to have fun, but you know what I mean? Like it's not that there were these great sex scenes that were helpful or illustrative of women's pleasures necessarily, but there was enough buildup for a woman to imagine that they would want what came next. And wow, man, those were some really problematic things that I'm reflecting on some of these scenes where I'm like, that was a problem. That was not consensual at all. And what was so hot about that was this idea of like, how do you maybe sexualize what's going to happen anyway? How do you make pleasurable this idea of like, you want it, like, well, I can see it coming. I don't know. What is it about the story that makes it a little bit better than the reality, of
Mhm.
not having consent, not having an opportunity to say yes or no.
I mean, the word kink came up early here from Seema saying that the constraints of genre can be seen as kinky, but I just thought about, in answer to that good question you just posed, Amber, that if nothing else, when you're picking up a book, because you're choosing to pick up the book, you're consenting, you're choosing, you're actively choosing, you have agency in engaging that story. And so, just like power play in sex or relationship that you're choosing can have like a special heat to it because you're maybe partly because you're engaging a dynamic that could be oppressive if you were not choosing it. So maybe there's something of that in those books, even the books that have really fucked up patriarchal violent power dynamics. And we're really excited to focus on love stories that tell, that engage different dynamics, that aren't like, can we find a way to make it hot when a man is trapping a woman in a room? That is not our goal. Although we could have a good conversation about why a lot of readers find heat there. Our goal is to like look at all the other ways that heat and romance blossoms between people.
There's an equality in these stories, an equality of like a meeting of a pair of equals. I'm thinking of and I texted you, Amber Flame, about this, about the spy story. And just like, yeah, these are two powerful people. And like sort of outsmarting each other in these ways, or like meeting each other, respecting each other. And I think of like, Rebecca Solnit wrote an essay about the opposition to marriage equality is not an opposition to same-sex marriage, but it's to equality in a marriage, right? That like the definition of marriage being one person less than the other, and how we turn that around as women coming into our power, and how then it doesn't feel like I don't know, it feels like it's possible when you read a story like that, where it's like you don't have to sacrifice, you don't have to be less. You can just reach for this thing as you are and reach for somebody who is as good as you.
Well, as Channing said, and I think it was, I don't know what part of my horoscope on the app, Channing Nicholas, astrologer, but she said the point of love is not to fall into love, but to rise up in it. And I think that like I keep reading that that portion, I think it's in my transits or something. This idea of like, because it's like fairy tales have wreaked havoc on our understanding of love and what it means to find your person. And I'm super curious. I'm only really interested in the kind of love stories, the kind of romance stories that are two whole people arrive healed to the party, that are like, I'm doing my work and I will continue to do my work. And here I am as a whole person wanting to meet because that's where the hope comes in. That's where the hope and joy in the future. That's what I can believe in is when I see somebody like struggling with their own shit, but not because of the relationship. The relationship is like a place in which they can find a way to like better themselves with support. What a concept, support. That's really sexy to me these days. Like acts of service are coming up on the love language. I never thought I was that kind of girl. But I'm like, you know what? You want to change my tires? That would be lovely. I might actually give you some for that. That's amazing.
The spy story that you're referencing, Seema, is Jessica P. Pryde. And it's an assassin and her mark. And yeah, this is something I'm loving in what we're publishing, but also in what I'm reading in a lot of other contemporary romance. And of course, it's what I'm choosing to read. So this is the lane I'm choosing to be in. I'm sure there's plenty of oppressive romance still still out there. In fact, I know there is, but there's so many ways to tell a story of, yeah, two strong people equals, but also still like it's still all about, we still all go around as humans being like, something is surely wrong with me, or one part of me is surely unlovable, or I will be worthy of XYZ when I fix these things about me. I think these things are pretty universal. And so in that story, the assassin is one of the best there is, and she can't kill her mark. And that makes her fascinated. She's like, oh, who's this person that I can't kill despite my extraordinary skill in my craft? And then this person is like, oh, who's this person who's trying so hard? And I see her skills, even though it turns out I'm invincible. But they have trust issues because one's an assassin and one's an undercover badass. And they get to, I'm just reading a book by Sarah Crawley called A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon. I found it very charming. I recommend it. In that book, the witch in question is like incredibly powerful, but because it's plant magic and it's not the kind of flashy witchcraft that her family does, there's no recognition of exactly how powerful she is. And this demon comes along and he's like, I see you. I see how powerful you are. He literally can see her power. But the metaphor of that immediately gets me, where I'm like, yeah, I too am a witch who wants to be seen for how powerful I am. I don't actually identify as a witch, but I too am I'm a magical being who wants someone to see how powerful I am. And then the demon is a demon. And he's like, just because I'm from the demon realm, everybody thinks I'm this horrible person, misunderstood. And she, falls in love with him, and he gets to heal that part of himself too. So that is a thing that I find over and over and over again, like, characters who we're publishing a lot of authors who are disabled. So characters who are loved not in spite of, but like deeply and specifically in the exact, form that their body is in. There's a Talia Hibbert character who has, I think, like severe fibromyalgia and has a hard time unscrewing jars. But her man like rigs a way for her to open the jar without his help, even when they're in a fight and he can't be in her apartment. He like sets up something because he's loving her specific body. It's just all these ways that like maybe in real life it's a real path to find a way to ask to be loved in all of our particularities. And I'm loving the way romance genre can like go specifically there to that pain point and proliferate examples of how there can be healing in those areas.
Do you find yourself like watching Bridgerton? Do you find yourself like being like, if they would just fucking keep talking, like say the thing over and over? I'm like, say the thing. Why aren't you saying the thing? Like I was sitting here, I was listening to you, Elaina, and like I always do, my brilliant friends, like I'm like, wow, right, this is another gift that is coming from this project, which is these opportunities to have these kind of conversations. Elaina and I be having these conversations on a regular, just in talking about what we're seeing or what we're working with. But then they evolve into, because of the friendship, they evolve into ourselves and our healing and our friends and their healing and all of that. And that's so wonderful. But like there's this piece of, I think, especially in queer family, in literary family, I don't know what it is, a special combination of word nerderies that we all exist in, where we fucking talk. We talk about these things, and I learn so much. And I'm listening to Elaine, and I'm going, right, here I am in my own secret struggle, all by myself, thinking something is wrong with me, but something's not supposed to be wrong with me. And I'm supposed to heal the thing that believes that something's wrong with me and like learn to love myself just now as I am. And like I'm sitting here doing my like secret little battle with my own brain. And then here comes Elaina saying this thing about something else. And I'm like, everybody, everybody. Everybody is doing their secret little punching battle with their brain about the way they're not loved or the way that they're not able to love themselves or the thing that keeps them from love or they whatever their list is, whatever their inner critic is. And just now got this like beautiful gift from the universe reminder that like I'm not the only, everybody, the beautiful, beautiful people I see right here on my screen are having the same little punch it out battle with their brain, different words maybe, but like the same battle of like, am I actually lovable? And I think that's like, then that means that's human condition. It's like the same thing about learning about pain. And when you experience chronic pain or chronic illness or anything like that, you start to see it in other people. I start to realize who else steps off steps down the stairs carefully because their knees are wobbly like mine, or just like notice that like the secret wincing that a lot of people like literally walk every day through it because I'm doing it now. And so the capacity for compassion, the capacity for human empathy, for life empathy, for the damage we do to each other just by thinking that we're the only ones suffering, it starts to shift when you're in these conversations of love. And I didn't see that coming, but I just had this moment where I was like, holy shit, that's right. Everybody's battling with this. And I'm over here journaling in the morning, doing my morning journal, like, oh my God, I'm going to figure out how to fucking love myself. And like, so is everybody, right? Or maybe not journaling, but everybody, right? That's
Right.
wild. Thank you.
Yeah. Seema wrote this sentence earlier this week, or I read it earlier this week in the San Francisco Chronicle article. Is that right? San Francisco Chronicle. The books are an engine for empathy. Is that the right? Did I say the phrase right? And I just like was so moved by it was an article about book bans, right? And when you think of that banning these stories, these engines for empathy and who is threatened by people having empathy. And book conversations are yet another, like, right, another layer. I remember the first time I met somebody who had read a book that I had read that I didn't know anyone else had read. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like you have that first, you're like, oh, you read that like weird thing. And I felt almost like, oh my gosh, you're like, I thought it was a private experience I had. And then you get to like see that thing in another way and see that experience of that thing, the way that I fight with loving myself is not the only way to fight with loving yourself. And I get to hear Amber's way of fighting with loving herself, and and Elena's and Seema's, and then I'm like, maybe able to borrow some of it, maybe able to be more generous with, because there's the fighting with loving myself, and then there's the judging myself for not being good at this yet. I'm so old, how could I not? So yeah, I think that all of that, Amber.
Thanks for saying that, Seema. Book bans are empathy bans. And I came to that sentence actually from Kwame Dawes and Roger Robinson, who I think Roger Robinson, he's a British poet who borrowed it from Kwame Dawes, who talked about poems. How did they phrase it? Poems are empathy machines, maybe something like that, right? And I've always thought about that. And then more recently, when I wrote that op-ed about my books being banned and what that meant in terms of you're banning stories about queer love and queer friendship and queer families, and you're specifically banning stories about queer teens and queer kids, right? But in the course of writing that op-ed, and I think I linked to it in it, I found scientific research about stories generating empathy. And they've done this research in young people and people of all ages. And imagine how isolating it is. And you don't have to imagine, because I think probably all of us have lived through that isolation of not seeing ourselves represented, and therefore just not having what you all are talking about now, which is it's not just me, it's everyone. And it's so lonely until you figure that out. And of course, we figure that out through meeting other people, but we also figure it out from reading those stories and having the empathy, and then also the self-compassion and the empathy for self.
You mentioned something about what's the threat when people ban books? Like, what's the threat of empathy? And I'm seeing this tie to earlier when we were talking about the belittling of romance, because it's a threat to conversations maybe between women about desire and pleasure. Belittling a book or a genre is like not the same as banning, but it's maybe a different strategy of moving those ideas out of the way and out of people's minds.
Moving those ideas out of the way. Damn.
We just we did a book launch in LA. We did book launches in New York and LA, both at the Ripped Bodice, which that's a store that's now franchised to 2 locations that is focused on romance. Really special place. But in LA, we had several authors in the book who are LA locals or who have family there. And so there were several generations in the room. The book spans several generations itself, but at this particular reading, we knew there were grandmothers in the room and mothers in the room and older aunties in the room. And I had some moments when we were on stage. It was a particularly spicy reading in terms of what, people are choosing at the different launches, which parts of their story to read. So some of them have more sexual content than others. Yeah, LA was a hot reading. And I had a moment where I sort of like briefly met eyes with who I believe is an Italian grandmother. And I was like, ooh, like I was having my own story about, we were offending her, we were frivolous in her eye. I mean, like, it's so interesting, all these things that I was telling myself just in that flash. And when the reading was over and everyone was filing out after the book signing and everything, this same woman, I said, thank you for coming. And she like caught my hand and held it and was like, this was so wonderful. This was so fun. I loved it, And somehow that flashed in my mind, Amelia, when you were talking again about this, the way that romance is sort of marginalized or shamed, and that I catch myself even doing it mentally, like it's like what? So I'm attaching it to youth, or I'm attaching it to, we are these like bad outlaws or something, as opposed to like, there is sexuality and there is romance and there is story and there is joy. And then there's like a variety of people who have a variety of tastes in what entertainment they take on, period, But the careful work of being like, this, even what though I'm making it the center of my life, being like, but it should really be kept over here, you know? It's like shame.
Yeah. Shame. And also like I was thinking about a conversation Amber and I had some time ago about like our kids acting like they invented everything.
Yeah.
What I love about it though is that it's once again it's such a curious opportunity to see something through different eyes, a different experience. And we've raised these little fuckers to be so free and like full of themselves, and that's wonderful. And I'm glad, and exactly the plan. And also like, how dare you? You know, there's that shame of like, fuck you, that comes up a lot. And it's interesting to like hold that for myself and like talk to my fellow adult friends about like this little fucker right here, you know, and love on him and let him be. But it's also teaching me so much because this generation is doing something different. They are doing something that I'm like, is this what they mean by back to Chani and astrology? Is this what they mean by like those major outer planets when they shift signs and you have like generational shifts? Because we have a generation here who is not like secretly like humping in the closet for the most part, or like they're a lot more um like romantic and asexual. There's a lot more conversation. You know, we talked about this idea of queer becoming a cultural identity instead of a sexual identity, and it's totally happened. This generation, without having any sense of themselves as sexual beings yet, are identifying as queer, and that's wonderful. And I'm for it, but it's like fascinating because I'm like, if you know, back to Seema, Yasmin, your point about like biphobia and all this stuff, like if we are not judging people by who they're fucking, then how do we know if they're on our side or team, or if I can mess with them, if it's safe? It's, you know, like we had so much, you know, coming out of the AIDS epidemic, coming into this very like openly queer, advocating for LGBTQ rights, all of those things happening in our generation has resulted in these kids being like, hi, my name is so and so, my pronouns are this. What about you? What's your pronouns? You know, like just like because that's what you do. And also like I'm trying to write a mystery romance novel because I love mysteries as much as I love romance. And I was like, oh shit, am I gonna have to learn how to write mystery and romance at the same time? It turns out that, you know, a bitch loves a challenge. So sure. But I'm also asking my kid to help like sort of co-write with me, this character, this main character who, or secondary character who's asexual. And what does it mean for the love story to be about loving somebody who has a different way of being loved? I keep thinking about that meme that's going around, like, let's honor queer romantic relationships that are not sexual, that are with friends. Like, I have a deeply romantic relationship, I feel, with Elaina, and she is one of my life partners. And I feel that very deeply. And we might not ever fuck, but or anything sexual. And that doesn't negate or diminish that in my life. I mean, we are talk about getting a joint bank account, and we're like, shit, we are more locked in than you know we have been with our partners at this point, and had a whole moment of commitment phobia around that. There's this beautiful new world that the kids are opening up to us, I think, about how to relate, how to have these like, I don't know, this different bodied romance. Like it hits the body differently. I was watching Too Hot to Handle, don't ask. I finished Perfect Matches, so then I had to watch Too Hot to Handle for the original character casting. You know, all these beautiful, gleaming young bodies are coming out, and my kid's like, I'm so gay. I'm getting I gotta go. And I was like, oh, okay. You know, that in have you seen Howl's Moving Castle? Studio Ghibli film, and he is very fey and is a queer awakening. Howl is a sorcerer, very, very beautiful. And my kid has a type, right? So I was like, oh, I see what's happening here. But it's not like, and so I want to kiss them, or I want to like, it's not a physical expression. It's like I'm having these romantic sexual, it's very different and weird. And so I'm like, you are inventing something. You are inventing something that doesn't end up in bed. And I don't understand. It's fascinating. It's not for me personally, but
I'm ending up in bed, thank you.
yeah, please, I hope.
No, but I think too, like the kids are not one thing, right? Like the kids are the kids that possibly have access to lots of different kinds of books. And there's this sort of like almost like a deepening cleaving of, yeah, people who have been exposed to other ways of thinking and being. And I mean, now we're talking about a bigger societal problem, but I mean, I hope that these kids can make something of what we like have handed them.
I mean, thinking about book bans and the related conversation about lack of representation in books historically and currently. To be clear, I don't think there's anything like I don't I don't want us to be like, here are the gifts of banning books, because that's not what I'm saying. Um but one thing I think about is like our generation and generations before us and in current generations, as you say, like there's kids all over the place who have a wide variety of access and lack of access to representation. But like those of us who did not grow up seeing ourselves, whatever aspect of our identities, in books and movies and popular culture, there's like this muscle of translation that gets formed, of, being able to like translate the hetero relationship into a queer relationship. And I think I did a lot of that personally. I think I did a lot of that work underground. It wasn't that I was consciously like, okay, but what if they were both women or whatever, but like um being able to insert yourself, like that conversation about empathy, reading is a practice of empathy, and poems being empathy machines, like the sort of extra effort towards empathy that gets developed when you're someone who is working to see yourself and your people in material that doesn't explicitly reflect you.
I'm floored by that because it resonates. That is it. And it's why there's sometimes a disconnect between people that haven't had that experience. And so you'll have a conversation and the conversation's going really well, and then suddenly it isn't, and you can't put your finger on it. And it's that. It's that. And maybe I envy them for not having had to do all that work, but maybe I don't, because I like the muscles I've developed around that. But that what you just said is like, oh my gosh, yes, that is the language of the disconnect I often feel, and which limits then romance. Or maybe it's not limit, it guides romance in a certain way towards certain people or certain communities of people, right? It's that. Yeah, thank you for giving words to that, putting words to that.
It seems so obvious, but I see these conversations in, like, I went to a romance convention focused on diversity and romance last year, it's called Steamy Lit. And some of the panel discussions there about anti-Black racism in the romance world, in romance readership and publishing. And some of the conversation was like, people that, I guess, they're the sort of defense from white readers who are reading racistly is like, well, I want to be able to see myself in the character, and people being like, oh wow, like kind of like, poor you and your tiny imagination that you haven't like look at all of the rest of the people on this panel. Like, do you think that we only read books where we could see ourselves and our particular experiences reflected in them? Because that would really narrow the fucking pile of books for a lot of people. But yeah, the lack of imagination there, yeah, wild to me that people would say something like that aloud as a defensible argument.
I don't know if it was the exact same panel, Elaina, but from that same convention, I heard about that conversation or similar, very similar conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And then going back to our first point, for Seema's first question about what is romance, my YA novel, the one that I wrote about getting banned, comes out on July 9. isn't really a romance novel, but Steamy Lit want to support it and do events around it. So that's really interesting. That there are some elements of romance in it, right? There's two girls on the cover. They're both 17, and one of them is a pansexual Palestinian girl. And so there is a romance element. And then her best friend standing next to her on the cover is a very horny hijabi girl who gets pregnant and has some commitment issues with her on and off again boyfriend. But I wasn't trying to write romance. I was trying to write about teen abortion and showing up to your friendships as your full, messy, weird self, which is something Seema's taught me so much about. But it's interesting that, Steamy Lit has received that as this is romance adjacent or something. I don't know. Because I was not expecting that love and that support from there.
But can't
I'm
it be
so
a
sold
vehicle?
on your book.
I
Oh,
know,
sorry,
right? I was like,
Amber.
I'm super excited, first of all, and it leads to a question that I had for you all. But can't maybe that's the thing is like the new world of romance is using it as a vehicle, using these constraints, these rules as a vehicle to talk about like maybe people wouldn't pick up a book that wanted to talk about teen abortion, but they'll pick up this romance and then like develop a little empathy muscle by reading this story where they're like rooting for the characters in their messy, full lives. I love that as like romance as a vehicle or a tool against oppression and as a tool of seeding information. I think that was the big thing, right? Like as misinformed or misguided or perhaps not anatomically correct as early romance was, it did serve as a tool for me to learn to understand myself in my own desire, my own pleasure. Um, and so what if we push it? What if it's a tool to understand the way disabled bodies love and the way queer relationships can be not sexual and still very, very romantic, and the way to understand teenage abortion and the complicities and complications therein, and the way to understand, like what if that is how we explain what asexual romance looks like and what not even romance, but what life looks like for these characters using the vehicle of a romance story. I'm for it. I want to know what romance stories you want to write because it sounds like you're already doing it. But we're always like, so are you gonna write a romance? What's it gonna be?
I mean, I loved writing the short story with the jinn romance because, we grew up with these scary stories about jinn that are these magical shape-shifting creatures, except they weren't. They were like boys or they were girls, which is weird. When you can play with gender, why not play with gender? And I would love to flesh that out into something, what exploration there is between the real world and the unseen world. And yeah, what kinkiness and what erotica means when you're crossing those boundaries, because it's all about boundaries.
Yeah, the fire and dust boundary. I love that idea of romance with across planes. I don't know that I'm not as good as that, the immediate pitch part here, but I am thinking a lot about, I got stuck when Seema was talking about Unbecoming, about how radical it is to write a happy ending for those characters. Like just, wow, that, that idea of like, no, I have decided that there will be a happy ending for these characters. It's just so beautiful. And coming back to my cynicism that I've been fighting as I've read this book, because I just haven't, you know maybe I feel guilty about happy endings in a world that's so full of unhappy endings, and maybe it has something to do with that belittling of like unrealistic, um or maybe it's just internalizing this idea that certain people just don't get happy endings, myself included in this.
Mm. Yeah, and in the case of Unbecoming, the happy ending is a testament to queer friendship. And getting out of your way and knowing that you will be loved because of your messiness, not in spite of it. Like you will be loved because of your weirdness and your contradictions, not in spite of them. Like that's the lesson Layla learns over the course of the week, during which the novel unravels. I will say YA is great for happy endings. Not saying it always happens or always has to be, but in my case, I had a very, very expert YA editor who was like, more hopeful, yeah, great draft, more hopeful, great chapter, more hope, you know. And it was nice to have that. It didn't feel disingenuous, it didn't feel inauthentic. It felt like me actually leading into my reality, in which we live in sometimes a dumpster fire of a world, but in which my friends give me hope on the day, by the hour, by the voice note, as we talk about the very real challenges. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I love YA. When we first started this project, I had just borrowed my kids' book. They Both Die at the End. Have you read They Both Die at the End? And as you were talking to, I was like, oh yeah, it's like why Frozen was so revolutionary, because it was actually the love story of two sisters instead of, like you just met him, like that was the first time where they kind of broke that wall. And just how powerful it is to get through and get by with a little help from your friends, like literally. But yeah, just this idea of more hopeful. Great chapter, more hopeful. I love that. I'm gonna have that. Great chapter, more hopeful.
That's a good little mantra. Great
Yeah.
chapter, more hopeful.
Putting that in my journal tomorrow.
I love it so much. Yeah, it actually was it was a beautiful and interesting experience being that editor with this book, and now with our future books, but engaging with a lot of poets, a lot of folks like all of you who write in other genres, and who don't necessarily usually operate under this rule of happy ending, and working with what people gave us, so what people submitted or their early drafts, rather than trying to like no forcing a happy ending or a fake ending, but like what's already there. Like Temim Fruchter, you had a beautiful interview with her about City of Laughter, her novel. So she's got a story in the book with two Jewish Orthodox women who fall in love, or who fall into something, right? But the original ending of that story in the draft she sent was like, neither of them knew what would happen next, but this was fun, in much more beautiful language. Like that was sort of the summary. And then it was like, well, what if it's neither of them know what's going to happen next, but the feeling in their body is hopeful. The feeling, or like, can you give us the sense that they're imagining, or that there's a calm knowing, or that there's a something in this moment that this happiness with this new connection is going to continue. And like, yeah, learning the art of editing towards hope without sacrificing the art.
Yeah, I think in poetry and in memoir, which are two primary genres that I write in, there is like, I'm constantly fighting this pressure to the so what has to be, it's very sad, right? But it doesn't, right? Like actually I can write a very beautiful thing that isn't about only the worst things. I think sometimes we're set up, especially in like the slam scene, right, around whose story is the saddest, whose story brings the audience to tears, right? And so then here you are like turning that on its head in this genre, and it feels like this immense, well, it's been a gift, actually. Thank you both.
Thank you for having a dinner party in which you pass out copies of the book. That is maybe the ultimate manifestation of our dream. And then I feel like this conversation is another little dinner party, brunch party, whatever it is. It's just, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of this.
CBAW Loves is a community building artworks podcast produced by Amelia Bain.
CBAW is committed to mission belonging, reconnecting veterans with their communities.
For more information, visit our website, www.cbaw.org.